Hello and welcome to a bonus video for MinnMax. My name is Ben Hanson and I'm joined by voice expert Emily Reese. How would you like to be introduced, Emily?
You can still call me a radio host. It's totally fine. Or podcaster. I don't know. Call me whatever you want.
Yeah, music extraordinaire, video game music connoisseur. You know her throughout the years. She's been on a million episodes of the MinnMax Show, probably just a couple actually, talking about game music and stuff. But for Better Quest this month, which is our show about getting better, setting personal goals, my goal this month was to try and improve the sound of my voice because I end up talking into a microphone all day and my voice is fine. I'm not trying to be humble or anything, but it's adequate. I've barely thought about it, but it's like, well, we should be trying to lighten the load on everybody's ears by trying to improve my voice a little bit. And I thought, who knows something about talking into a mic? And it's you, because you spent 16 years on radio.
Yes, it's been a long, long time, indeed.
Oh my God. Okay, walk us through how you boiled down the best voice on mic.
Well, that's a really complex question to answer, as I'm sure anybody would say the same thing, because what it comes down to is that you want to sound like yourself, right? You want to sound like you are a human being with compassion and care and knowledge, and you just want to sound all of those things when you're on the radio. And the only things that made me better at all of that, I think, aside from training, of course, when you're in radio, you get training from your mentors, you get, you learn things from your colleagues, they bring in people for special days of learning on how to be a better radio announcer. All those things happen. But the one thing that helped me become better fastest was listening to myself all the time when I edit myself. So I edit almost every single project I voice, whether it's a short interview on the radio. I would always edit those. Even if they were 8 minutes long, I'd always listen through, clean it up if necessary. And that is a remarkable way to hear yourself and understand what your flaws are, what your strengths are, and to try and either get rid of those flaws or capitalize on your strengths. So those are the ways that I feel like I got better right away. So just because one of the things, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I think a lot of people watching this or listening to this, their first reaction will be, hell no, that sounds miserable. Listening to myself is terrible. It never sounds like what I think I sound like. And so is the lesson just like, yeah, suck it up. You just have to listen to it and just get over that idea that it's inherently bad, because your voice isn't bad. It's just you're very self-conscious, everybody. And that's just how you can pick up on those little ticks. But then to add on to that, how do you get out of your head? Say you listen back to yourself and you realize I'm saying all the time, or I'm saying like all the time. It's not as easy as just being aware of that, because if you're aware of that, then you're going to stumble over your own voice all the time.
That's a good point. I think one of the things I rarely edit out of my own speech, which I often will edit out of a guest, especially if the guest asks, is all of those ums and uhs. I usually just leave all of that in with me because people talk like that. That's very normal. That's a very conversational way to speak. And if there's one thing that's beaten into our heads in radio, it's that you want to sound conversational. You want to sound like a human. You want to sound like a normal person. And normal people say and and like all the time. Now, there are extremes, right? And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is if you hear something and you're like, wow, I say that all the time. How am I going to get out of that? Well, you write things down. And it's really unglamorous, but that's probably the second most thing that got me better, was to write down my questions or my thoughts or whatever it is. And now sometimes, of course, almost always when I have an interview going, I've got a Google Doc open or some kind of doc open with all my questions. Sometimes it's on a notepad. And then I really just focus on asking what I want to ask. I got really sick of editing down my 1 minute, 19-second question that could have taken me 17 seconds to say. And I still am guilty of that all the time, but writing it down helps to avoid that because it keeps you to that. People are smart. They know what you're trying to say. And so just say it and get it done. And so writing it down, I think, is one of the ways to eliminate those stumbles. Now, when you're in conversation and you're talking and you don't have things written down, that's a different story. But generally speaking, if you're trying to sound, professional and improve the way that you sound, whether you're interviewing someone or you're just having a conversation over the phone or something, try and write down as much as you can. And you can write it down word for word, although that can get you kind of hung up too.
Yeah.
So a lot of times I just do some kind of paraphrasing. But I mean, in the beginning, I did literally write out word for word. And I went through phases in radio where, like, in the very beginning, I did that, and then I stopped doing it, and then I realized I needed to do it again. So just to get better. Yeah.
So when you were getting these professional radio lessons, they were bringing in people and they were emphasizing compassion above all else. Do you remember other big beats they were hitting? Because it's like, it's compassion, but also a little authority in there too, right?
Yep, definitely. And it's also speaking to one person.
This is huge. You told me this on the podcast a while ago, and I can't stop thinking about it.
It's huge. I cannot tell you how big of a difference it makes whether you're hearing someone in a podcast or on the radio or in any way speak to that they're speaking to hundreds or thousands or millions of people. It makes such a big difference if they sound like they're talking to you. And you know that they're not, but it still feels more real. And it feels less like, oh, I'm just in this big mob of no one. It's speak to one person. So those are probably the three most, the compassion with authority and try and talk to just one person. So instead of saying all of our listeners out there, you could just say you, and just say you, and that is a very difficult concept for people to wrap their brain around. Just having, when I was on the jazz station doing usually 2 live interviews a day, not during COVID. I pre-recorded them during COVID, but even then, 2 interviews a day, trying to get people to understand that in the appropriate situation, because some people don't need to understand that. But sometimes, especially repeating guests that came back maybe weekly or bi-weekly, trying to get them to kind of settle into that, where you're talking to just one person, it makes a really amazingly large difference when you're a listener. Especially just for simple things like plugs at MinnMax, when I'm talking about Patreon and Patreon benefits, I found that it really helps to reframe it instead of just saying, go to patreon.com/MinnMax. Everybody head over there, check out the benefits. You can join us on Trivia Tower, to make it very specific about, like, if you know a lot about video games, you can win in Trivia Tower by supporting us at any tier. And I think about you every time I do it, Emily Reese. Oh, that's amazing, Ben Hanson. I love that. What about speed? Some people are very slow. Some people are very fast. Have you had to course correct? Do you have thoughts on the right tempo here? I never really had too much trouble with that. I was one of those kids, and I swear this is probably where it all started. I loved, and some kids hate this, and I feel so bad for kids like that get picked on in class to read out loud. Yeah. We'd go, I don't know if they do that much anymore, but I mean, in the 80s, that's like every single class from first grade on, you're going around the room reading out loud. And I always loved it. And there is also a difference between reading something out loud and reading something out loud that you want to help someone understand using inflection and tone. Because you can read a sentence that says, well, here's my, hang on. Like, here's my national. Everything just blew up. Does it sound, no, it's way down. Yeah, it's way down. Another important tip, make sure your mic is not way down. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's actually really a good point, is to understand what kind of microphone you have, because of course, as I move this way, this kind of microphone is really directional. So I need to pretend like this is part of my face. And you just can't be moving around, right? Right. It won't record right. But my point back to the, reading for understanding is, you can say, gonna let that plane go by. I don't know if you edit though. I can. Maybe you don't edit that out. You don't have to. I don't care. But you can say a sentence. This is an evening to meet new neighbors and build community, right? So as a listener needs to do a little more work to understand that, unless you help them with inflection and tone, right? This is an evening to meet new neighbors and build community. Like that, even just that small difference, can help someone understand, by circling or underlining the important words. I had to do that stuff when I first started. When I would read a news story, my boss would always be like, why did you say to meet new neighbors instead of to meet new neighbors? Or, you know what I mean?
Right.
So it's stuff like that.
I'm trying to figure out if people are hearing that, okay, be compassionate idea, they're probably going to stop sounding like themselves. Every once in a while, I'll hear somebody in like a video essay format or something, and I just think, that's not how you sound. Maybe it doesn't matter for people that only know them online, but how do you still try and convey your sense of self and not sound insincere?
That's tricky. And the word compassionate, I guess friendly is another word that could be used instead of compassionate, where you just don't sound agitated or annoyed. You just sound calm and collected and authoritative. Things like that, I guess.
Yeah.
And again, I picked that up just from listening to myself. And one of the hurdles you can kind of try to get over that, if for people who really hate listening to themselves, is that you're the only person who thinks that you don't sound like that.
Yes.
Everyone else who's ever heard you in your entire life thinks that's exactly what you sound like, and would be shocked to hear what actually is heard inside your head. And of course, that's from the whole HRTF thing of how sound bounces around your face and your skeletal structure and how you hear inside your own head. And you can't change any of that. And you're never going to sound in your head like the rest of the world thinks you sound, or knows you sound. So that was one of the things that helped me get over that too. I'm like, listen, I'm the only one who thinks this doesn't sound normal. Everyone else knows that's what I sound like.
Yeah.
So it can help you kind of get past that and just realize, well, for the last 44 years of my life, everyone has heard me just like that. So
do you feel like a lot of it's just practice for you? Do you remind yourself about key lessons? Are there key things like breathing techniques, or is it just, I don't know, you're in front of a mic long enough, you pick it up?
It's a little of both, but there are some really key things again there. Like, obviously I'm slouching right now, and if I sat up, it makes a huge difference in your projection and tone. So sometimes if I'm recording an intro and I don't like the way it sounds, I'll just be like, oh, well, you're slouching, sit up, or something like that. Also, sometimes for one of my traps that I fall into, particularly with the podcasts, and that I've tried hard to get out of, is sounding like a radio announcer. Yeah. Because there's definitely that tone as well. And especially like the news side of the jobs that I've had in the past, because I've gone in and out of working in news radio as well. And that's like a whole different tone and structure too. And sometimes I'll just be reading an intro that I've written out, and sometimes I'll just like throw it out, try to do it off the top of my head, then find a blend, because I do fall into traps, and I'll listen to myself and I'll be like, good Lord, this fresh air right now. This is a really great interview with an amazing composer, or whatever it is,
Right.
So yeah, I'm sorry, I kind of got off on a tangent there. I can't remember.
No, that's fair. Like, I think it's like breathing. Yeah. I don't know.
Breathing. Breathing is one thing. And that when you're live on the air, I think of it more when I'm live, just because of gulping air. And we had a professional consultant come in to help us talk about that too, because that can harm your whole vocal apparatus, just the way you inhale. What? And so if you're, that's way deep in the weeds, but you can become a much more efficient breather, I think, in general, obviously, but when you're speaking live, that's a much more of a consideration for sure.
I've noticed, especially when I'm doing plugs on the MinnMax Show podcast, I will be out of breath at the start of the plugs, and I just get up in my head and start thinking, I have so much text to go through. I don't know where I'm going to breathe, and I'm still not good at it. But every once in a while, I'll try to remind myself that you can slow down at any point. As long as it's intentional, no one's going to question it. I always think of like, this is maybe a boring or old political deep cut now, but I always think of like Marco Rubio back in his rebuttal to the State of the Union when he's like, bleh, bleh, and like grabs that panicky drink of water and he just looked super weird doing it. If he just would have been like, hang on a second, and casually walked over and sipped that bottle of water, no problem. But it's the idea of like trying to quickly breathe in when you don't need to. That's when you're going to sound like a maniac. But if you just intentionally slow things down and make it seem intentional, I think you're fine and safe and no one's going to call you on it.
And you speak quick too. You have a quick pace to you. Yeah. So that would be, I would say, if you ever went into professional radio, that would be something that you'd get worked with on, because that's just anyone who speaks quickly, because again, you want people to absorb what you're saying. And if you don't do this, but some people are just like, and then you're just like, yeah, you gotta slow down. But thankfully, I never had too much trouble with speed. That was never too much of an issue. There's software that stations use that can help you time out script so that you don't have to sit there and clock it for yourself, so that you can type out a script, put in your audio elements, and it sums all of that together and estimates how long that'll be. And you can kind of adjust your read rate. And I never really had to adjust the norm. I was always like right about the norm.
All right, quit bragging, Emily. We get it.
Yeah, I'm just such a professional then.
Well, I know.
I just got lucky with that one.
So I do talk really fast, especially in recordings. It's mainly out of fear about just let me get my point out real quick and then move on. Blah 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 blah. Do you have? I know this is very narcissistic, but do you have other tips for me? Would you say really try and slow down is a big one?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's a big one, because I think, listen, the proof is in the pudding, right? I think if you had any huge issues with your delivery, nobody would listen to your content, but people love your content. So I don't really think that that's an issue. I just notice it with you, because that's just how you are. You get excited and you're just like, listen, I want to tell you all these things. So I would never call that something that you have to fix or anything like that. If you went on the radio, like classical radio, they might be like, listen, you got to slow down a little. But if you were like, I don't know, like Hits 101, it would probably be just fine. So
okay. And podcasting is somewhere in the middle ground between classical radio and Hits 101.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's totally fine. I think, again, if that was a big problem, then that would be reflected in your product. And
but you never know. I mean, people that listen to a podcast and say, this guy talks too fast, therefore I'll stop listening. They're not going to go out of the way to leave an iTunes review or something. Like, there's no way to convey the amount of people that we lose because I'm a blabbermouth.
That's a good point, but I really would caution you to put too much thought into that. I really don't think that's a problem. It's just a difference in you and me. That's all. But it's in no way I would consider that anything, problematic, as it were.
Okay.
I mean that. I mean that.
No, that's very sweet. Every once in a while, and this is a luxury that very few people have, but I can go back and listen to like recordings of myself from 10 years ago, something from Game Informer or something like that. And it always stands out to me how flat I am in my delivery.
Yeah.
And so every once in a while, I'm worried about over learning the lesson, because I can get up in my head and think, okay, so if I was flat and now I'm more of a roller coaster when I talk, or there's probably a smoother way of putting that, if I just keep increasing that roller coaster ride, that's going to be better and better. And that's where I'm going to be moving into the future until I'm full on Greg Miller screaming into a microphone, right? Like I think that's the end result. But I'm trying to figure out what is that right level. And is that good advice for everybody? We already talked about a little bit about just hitting key words, but just to try and make sure you're not too flat, even though I think the flatness, I'm rambling now, but I think the flatness comes from like being nervous a lot of the time. Like no one's being very dynamic on a first date if they're super nervous about it, right? But turns out that's how you express a personality. And so can you force yourself to be more uneven with your speaking pattern?
I'll give you a little anecdote.
Please.
I took voice lessons, pardon me. It was probably like 2008. When I first moved to the Twin Cities. And it was with this wonderful woman named Mary Rabine, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, but she was great. And one of the tricks that she would use, because I was trying to get into like reading ad copy and stuff like that, and I can do that, but there are other people who can do it better. to this day. I never really, whatever. One of the things that she had me do that helps so much, and it's really weird, is if you have like a couple sentences or a paragraph, let's say you're writing an intro, and you record your intro and you listen back and it's really flat and you're like, what the hell? Don't record it, or you can if you want. Shout it as loud as possible and as fast as possible. So you're like, hello neighbors, please join us for National Night Out. Like, and you're just like going balls to the wall. And then you finish it, immediately take a big breath and read it normally. And it's remarkable how I don't know the science behind it, but your brain just knows, like, well, now I'm reading normally. So I'm going to read it like I would if I were telling it to someone, which is to use inflection in the right place and to use tone properly. And it's an amazing, amazing trick. And like, weird. I wish I could high five her for that one right now, because I do that constantly still. If I hear something back that I'm pre-recording and I'm like, ooh, I'm just not in it. I can't get in the mode right now, or whatever it is. If you just shout like that as fast and kind of loud as possible, and then go back to a normal read, it can really help you to find those peaks and valleys that make the sentences interesting.
Yeah. Huh. Something I found too is when I'm recording something by myself, it's usually like, hey, announcing the deepest dive on Dead Space. Let's all play that. I can hear kind of the boredom or insincerity in my voice, and something that's helped, I think, is actually being physical. I don't know how often you do that, but like if I'm actually moving my hands and flailing around, it sounds better for whatever reason.
Yeah. Well, because it's natural, right?
I guess so, yeah.
I think having spent so many years in radio, my inclination is to not do that, but I don't think that there's any wrongness in doing it. I think that's how you want to sound normal, right? And that's what we do when we're speaking normally, is to use body language and to flail our arms and hands and make signs. And I mean, that's just what we do. So anything that you can do that doesn't compromise the quality of the audio, that helps you sound better, try it, do it. There's nothing wrong with that. Nobody, especially in audio recording, nobody's watching. And that's the best part. So
yeah. What about, screaming before you read something is good, but do you have other just general warm-ups before you go on the mic in general?
I don't know if I would say screaming necessarily. Might be a little hard on your voice, but loudly shouting,
sure,
which maybe is also hard on it, but I don't know. It's funny you just took a drink. I always have to have water nearby. Yeah. You never know when you're suddenly going to have mouth noise, and some people have mouth noise all the time. And some, that just, you can only hear their spit moving around in their mouth and stuff like that. And some people don't have a problem with it, but I always have a couple of things handy when I record. Always, always, always. I always have a pen and paper or something to write on or something to type on, and water. Those are, I think, like the three most indispensable items after you've got everything else, right? The mic and all that crap. I've got to have my pen and paper and my water. Water. Make sure you're well hydrated all the time, especially in this heat. It's good. It helps your voice a lot.
Perfect. Other good tips? I'm always interested in those, the lessons that you took. The lessons that other people paid for. If you could just give it to the world for free, Emily, things that stood out,
right? That's the story of my life. I think, back to that, which we've talked about a little already, talking to one person. Yeah. That can seem amorphous unless you choose a person. And you're like, I'm going to talk to Ben today. That it's amazing how much that makes a difference if you just choose a person. And it can be the same person, it can be a different person based off of what you're talking about. But sometimes it's like, how would you say this if you were saying this to your best friend or your brother or your girlfriend or your mom? I mean, what would you sound like? How would you explain it to them if you're having trouble with wording or inflection? I'll pick a person, and that helps a lot too, as opposed to trying to think, I'm going to talk to one anonymous person that doesn't have a face or a name or a gender. Right. Now I'm going to talk to a person that has a name and a face and maybe a gender. But yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful.
It's helpful.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Emily, thank you for making people in our audience better at speaking, because I'm still struck by it all the time that we have MinnMax Council, which is our Patreon exclusive podcast. And at the end of every month, community members call in. And it's so funny to see people be nervous going into that. Then they do it and it's great and easy and hopefully everybody has a good time. But then I always see people afterwards jump in the Discord and MinnMax and just say, I listened to myself and I did not recognize that person. It is just unnerving. And everyone's so self-conscious about their voice and everybody sounds fine. So the quicker you can get over that hurdle of being so sensitive about your own voice, I think the better off you'll be.
Yeah, and that's something also that we learned as musicians. You're supposed to record your practice. Supposed to, listen to me. But I mean, that was one of the recommendations from teachers all throughout my trumpet playing career. Record your practice sessions. I never, ever did that because no. But it's the same with speaking, right? You can get over that hurdle because how many times do you, like those folks who call in, like never hear themselves. And so the one time they do, they're like, oh, but if you do it and do it and do it and do it and do it, then you'll get over it. And it helps a lot. It helps a lot.
For sure. Emily, thank you for your wisdom.
Ben, so nice to talk to you.
So nice to talk to you. Are you up for doing a big podcast in the near future about the best game music from 2021?
Yep, let's do it. And I might cheat a little and talk about Half-Life Alyx only because that soundtrack still isn't done. So I feel like it still counts. Wait,
the soundtrack isn't done?
He's still not finished with the soundtrack.
Oh, like
so
the standalone
I decided
thing.
to go ahead and I decided. I mean, the music's done, obviously. But he just hasn't made it into the soundtrack.
Well, hey, if you had to direct people with a plug, where would you bring them to follow your work these days?
I would bring them to levelwithemily.com or just Level with Emily on any of your podcast providers. If you want to hear great interviews with composers and other people who make audio and games. And then Scores and Pours is my podcast about wine, beer, spirits, cocktails, and classical music and jazz. And we've actually just started for 2 years. We did almost no interviews. It was just the two of us, my friend Jill Mott, who's a sommelier, and me. And now we've started doing interviews, which has been amazing. Like Friday, we spent 3 hours over at the Arboretum at the U talking to the people who propagate the vineyard there. And so just cool stuff like that has been really fun to bring in. And we interviewed also, that winemaking game, 100 Days, came out a few months ago. Yep, we interviewed Eve Holler, who made the game, which was super fun. So stuff like, there's been a lot of fun crossover in that way. So Scores and Pours is one podcast, Level with Emily is another, and I just love sharing great music with people in all kinds of ways. So find me there.
That's perfect. Sweet. Thanks so much, Emily. And thank you so much for watching or listening to this bonus video. We appreciate it, and we'll see you in the near future. Actually, we'll see you next week with Better Quest, where I have to report back to Jeff Cork everything I've learned about the human voice. So we'll see how it goes. But thanks so much, everybody. Bye. If you are sick of snark, clickbait, and an avalanche of movie news, you can help support independent games media by subscribing to MinnMax's YouTube channel here or checking out the benefits over on Patreon. It's a nice, clean handshake. You support us, and we won't make dumb, condescending stuff for you. Your support helps us continue our mission of focusing on games, friends, and getting better. Patreon.com/MinnMax with 2 N's. We'd appreciate it.